World War I was one of the largest wars in history. While the common perception of most people is dominated by the endless killing in the trenches on the Western Front, there were many other fronts that never got a chance to have their story told. One of these fronts was the intense rivalry between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. This intense rivalry would culminate in the Battle of Jutland in May of 1916. The reason for the Battle of Jutland stems back to the start of the war when the British blockaded the German coast. This prevented vital food imports and other resources from coming into Germany, and if the food ran out, the civilian populace would revolt against the government. The German High Seas Fleet was then tasked with destroying a portion of the British Grand Fleet to hopefully level the playing field a little bit in May of 1916. The goal was to bring the British superiority from 1.5 to 1 and in favor of the British in terms of capital ships to a much more manageable 1.2 to 1, where the Germans had a much higher chance of winning a decisive naval engagement later. In doing so, both countries amassed large fleets for the upcoming battle. In Germany, they amassed 99 ships under Hipper and Scheer, with a battle cruiser and a main fleet force. The British did the same with 151 ships to prevent the Germans from destroying their fleet. And fortunately for Britain, in the Admiralty room, room 40, they cracked the German naval codes and they knew the Germans were coming. On May 30th, 1916, the battlecruiser squadrons under Beatty are the first to leave port, with the 5th Battle Squadron and trailing behind. Followed by this are the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Battle Squadrons, with the 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadrons under Admiral Jellicoe further north at Scapa Flow, and they both begin to sail east towards the Jutland Peninsula. 4 hours later, Admiral Hipper with his 5 battle cruisers leaves port at Wilhelmshaven. Following him is Admiral Scheer with the 16 dreadnoughts and 6 pre-dreadnoughts of the main force of the High Seas Fleet. The latter of these are called the 5-Minuten-Schiffs, based on how long people would think they would last in a clash between dreadnoughts. On the 31st of May in the early afternoon, both battlecruiser forces, screening cruisers, and destroyers spot a Danish steamer. They move forward to investigate, just to find the enemy fleet just over the horizon past said Danish steamer. Across both fleets, battle stations are called and crews begin to assemble at their guns. As the battle cruisers close the range, the Germans are the first ones to shoot, opening the Battle of Jutland. As the engagement intensifies, the first blood is drawn by the Germans when the British battlecruiser Indefatigable is absolutely annihilated by 2 283mm shells fired by von der Tann. The shells detonate inside the magazines, and because of the poor handling practices of charges, is the flash caused by the charges going off spreads through the ship and ignites them all, resulting in a massive explosion that takes all but 2 of Indefatigable's crew. As the battle rages on, the 5th Battle Squadron that has been absent from the main battlecruiser fight begins to finally get in range. However, their fire is not effective. As soon as the 5th Battle Squadron gets into range, the next ship falls on the British side, being the Queen Mary, which it suffers the same fate as Indefatigable. As the British fleet runs south, engaging the German battlecruisers, they don't yet know that the main force of the High Seas Fleet is just over the horizon. The German ships continue to score hits on the battlecruiser fleet under Beatty as the range closes for the main force of the High Seas Fleet to engage. By the time the High Seas Fleet is spotted, it takes very quick thinking by Beatty to withdraw his forces north to join up with the Grand Fleet. The 5th Battle Squadron, with its new Queen Elizabeth class battleships, covers the battlecruisers as they try to run away from the numerically superior German guns. It is important to note at this time that the Germans were better trained and had better technology than the British. However, the British had the numbers and the experience that the Germans had lacked. The 5th Battle Squadron was absolutely hailed on by German and shells from the battleships and battle cruisers as they tried to fight the desperate rearguard action to allow Jellicoe's main fleet to form up. As the 5th Battle Squadron continued to have shells rained down upon them by the High Seas Fleet, Jellicoe began to form his ships into a single-line battle column. Jellicoe's hope was to create a classic naval maneuver called Crossing the T, where all of his ships could intersect the column of enemy ships and rain down fire upon the enemy ships while reducing the amount of fire coming back at them, as the enemy ships would not be able to fire the full broadside weight of their main guns. As the Germans came into range, Jellicoe's ships' rangefinders began to find their ranges and open fire. The impact of the withering firepower would have been very frightening to German sailors deep within their ships, as they would not be able to see what's going on and could only hear the scrapes of ricocheting shells, explosions of near misses, and feel the rumblings as their ships got hit by heavy shells weighing in the size of a small car of today. It's also important to note how the weather and the positioning of the ships impacted the Germans' ability to return fire against the British fleet. As there was a setting sun in the sky, it made range finding for the Germans much harder staring into the setting sun. Additionally, the wind caused the own Germans' gun smoke to blow right back into their rangefinders while clearing the British, allowing the British to maintain a high level of accuracy and make it very much harder for the German ships to return fire with accurate salvos. While the Germans were able to score some victories, like against HMS Warspite, destroying Warspite steering gear, the Germans were still under a hail of fire, which added to the chaos. The German ships' decks were turned into shrapnel cities as the withering British fire came down upon them. Scheer retreated once and pulled back to reform his battle line, tried again to force a engagement against the British, and sent himself right back into the meat grinder. In doing so, Scheer, for the second time, he found himself in a much worse position. He ordered then the battle cruisers under Hipper to draw away some of the fire as his own ships continued to succumb to withering firepower from the 40-plus British heavy warships. This phase of the battle is known as the death ride of the battle cruisers, as the battle cruisers are out in front of Scheer's line and desperately tried to draw away the British firepower from their main fleet and save the dreadnought battleships. The scenes aboard the battle cruisers, who had already fought against the British battle cruisers earlier, are horrendous. Steel is torn in ways that are incomprehensible to the men, and as their ships are shelled into oblivion without them knowing what the hell's going on above decks. Scheer pulls away and attempts to retreat towards Wilhelmshaven the next day to get into port. In doing so, though, as Scheer pulls away, he puts the British Grand Fleet in between him and home. After getting mauled by Jellicoe's Grand Fleet for a second time, Scheer decides it's time to return home to Wilhelmshaven. Scheer's fleet has been severely damaged in the engagements over the course of the day. As it turns to night, Scheer has two options to return home. First, there's to go south, and second, to go via the Horns Reef further north. The problem is Scheer has to avoid the Grand Fleet that's in between him and Wilhelmshaven. Scheer decides to go via the Horns Reef as cutting behind the British battle line is deemed much easier than trying to get around it to the south in time. Scheer's battle cruisers detach from the main fleet to try and make their way home on their own. In doing so, this causes much confusion among the German ships in the night, as both sides' fleets don't have the proper experience to be coordinating large fleets and navigating at night when there is potential enemies around. Scheer's fleet cuts across into the trailing destroyer force that sits behind the Grand Fleet. And in the ensuing night action, battleships of Scheer's High Seas fleet are continually harassed by swarms of British destroyers. In one engagement, and Nassau is clipped by the British destroyer HMS Spitfire, taking off part of Nassau's armor belt when the two ships ram each other. And another engagement in SMS Pommern is severely damaged by British destroyer attacks and torpedoes, leaving it a hulking wreck. Pommern later sinks due to detonations within her magazines. In another area of the fleet, SMS Lutzow, Hitler's flagship, is decided to be scuttled because of its extensive damage and not being able to keep up. Additionally, several of the High Seas Fleet's torpedo boats are also destroyed in the ensuing night actions. While the High Seas Fleet has better nighttime equipment, and they are so badly damaged and disoriented from the whole day of fighting that it makes any kind of navigation difficult through the narrow channels to avoid the mines in the area. Without the loss of any more ships other than Pommern and Lutzow, the High Seas Fleet makes it back into port on June the 1st in the early morning hours. After the Battle of Jutland, a lot of analyzing of what happened had gone on within the German Navy. The battlecruiser fleet was more or less destroyed, with Der Flinger being the only intact modern battlecruiser. Von der Tannenwald not very heavily damaged. She really started to show her age. Lutzow would have to have been scuttled at sea, and then Seydlitz and Moltke were heavily damaged, and Seydlitz herself would never be put to sea again, as seen here. The dreadnoughts had also suffered pretty heavily, also taking a lot of damage in the engagement. And thus, instead of trying to go toe-to-toe with the British fleet again during the war, the surface units of the High Seas Fleet now would be guarding German U-boat bases, which the U-boats were having a much higher level of success than their surface counterparts, leaving the surface fleet into a subordinate role compared to the U-boat arm. Additionally, most new construction after this was halted because of the large amount of losses, and it wasn't seen feasible to recoup them. Another casualty that is not as well talked about is how the Battle of Jutland really crushed the idea of Germany being a naval power in the eyes of sailors who had grown up with this fledgling idea of Germany could be a great naval power and starting to have a naval tradition of its own. It was really crushed at Jutland, as everyone saw the writing on the wall that Germany really can't challenge the British Grand Fleet anymore. And this would affect Germany as it progressed in the 20th century. When World War II came about, the Germans more heavily invested in a large U-boat arm, learning that U-boats were more effective during the First World War, and were trying to replicate that. And the Germans only built 4 battleships between the interwar years and World War II. Nothing like the numbers they had in World War I. And so, really, the Battle of Jutland, in short, is the death of Germany's dreams to have a large surface fleet.